Yesterday, during the live streaming worship of May the 10th, we experienced some difficulties with our audio. And so, because some of those difficulties occurred during the preaching of the sermon, this is actually a re-recording of yesterday's sermon entitled The Sound of His Voice. In a story whose origin has become lost in my memory, a seminary professor tells of a profoundly teachable moment in his own life when he had cited in the garden as a sappy and sentimentalized style of poor hymnody, even to the point of ridiculing the hymn by singing an uncomplimentary rendition of it. After class, a woman waited to speak with the professor until after all the other students had left, at which point she challenged him to never make fun of that song ever again. She explained that growing up, she had lived in a highly dysfunctional family and that her only respite, her lifeline, was to go outside the house and walk in the yard and sing to herself the words from In the Garden. He speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet the birds hush their singing. And the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. The hymn, she said, had saved her. The teacher had become the student, and it was an invaluable lesson that he never forgot and that he shared willingly. In the Garden was written, according to Robert Morgan, by C. Austin Miles, a pharmacist who began writing songs and eventually became an editor of hymns and songbooks. His hobby was photography, and one day in March of 1912, while waiting for film to develop, he began reading his favorite chapter in the Bible, John 20, commenting, "As I read that day, I seemed to be part of the scene. Mary, leaning her head upon her arm at Jesus' tomb, wept. Turning, she saw Jesus standing. So did I. She knelt before him with arms outstretched and looking into his face cried, Rabboni. Under the inspiration of this vision, I wrote as quickly as the words would be formed the poem, exactly as it has since appeared. That same evening, I wrote the music." If we go back 10 chapters in John's Gospel, there is another scene we are meant to be part of, as we hear Jesus' voice amidst images that are familiar and perhaps even favorites, but may also have become slightly sentimentalized or romanticized. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, whose voice the sheep recognize. On a Sunday when we hear the most familiar of all scriptures, the 23rd Psalm, and when Jesus appropriates that metaphor as John tells his gospel, and when in this sanctuary and many others with stained glass, there is the iconic and pastoral depiction of Jesus among the sheep, a shepherd's staff in one hand, and a little lamb held protectively in the other arm, we might wonder if there is anything more to Jesus than a comforting, meek and mild image of him. There's nothing wrong, of course, with that picture of Jesus. The Gospels agree. He is the one who brings comfort to those afflicted, and it might be what we need most in these unsettling days. But we wonder if there might be more to the Good Shepherd than only a sense of comfort. Or perhaps another way to say this is, what are the ways in which the Good Shepherd does, in fact, comfort? If we've spent any time in John's Gospel, we know that nothing is ever as it initially seems. If we only skim across the surface of John's good news, then we will miss the many layers that he intends. John is honest enough to say that after Jesus uses his first image about a gatekeeper and a shepherd and a thief and a bandit, the disciples did not understand what he was saying to them. Well, of course they did not understand. These disciples are a bunch of fishermen and tax collectors, and even though they lived and worked in an area where there were plenty of shepherds and their flocks, some of the metaphor was lost to those who work with nets and spreadsheets. Who can understand another person's work completely? And besides which, advanced publicity on sheep was not all that complimentary, too often being depicted as a bunch of dumb animals who want to be led and cared for by a trusted protector rather than driven and whistled at by a bunch of cowhands. And besides, who wants to identify with a group that is constantly getting sheared? Jesus, according to John, is not discouraged by the initial woolly response of the disciples. He reminds the disciples that not all self-proclaimed shepherds are trustworthy. Some of the shepherds are on the take. Some of the shepherds have not cared for or protected the flock. Some of the shepherds are in it only for personal interest. Some of the shepherds devour some of their sheep. Some of the shepherds are wolves pretending to be shepherds. He is reminding the disciples what prophets like Jeremiah and Zechariah have said before, that not everyone who sounds like a shepherd is a shepherd. And from cults to the latest iteration of Elmer Gantry, to those who manipulate and abuse, Jesus is saying to listen closely and watch carefully. Because while most shepherds are probably pretty good, there are some who aren't. It's a sobering message. But Jesus says, the good shepherd is one who serves, so that people may have life and have it abundantly. It's the kind of phrase that rolls off the tongue, but we know John is always going a bit deeper than a surface hearing of the words. When John wrote his gospel about Jesus, Warren Carter reminds us that it was the typical political practice for the Roman emperor to be referred to as a good shepherd, who looks out for the security and abundance of the subjects, a protector who secures the borders, a warrior who saves the people from attack and economic harm, a benefactor whose provision leads to abundance. Despite that rhetoric, such claims of wholeness and well-being for the society were belied by the sickness and the poverty of the many. So when Jesus speaks of being the good shepherd, he is offering more than a pastoral image. He is offering a critique of Roman rule. He is saying that the language of good shepherd has been co-opted by those who do the very opposite of what God's good shepherd does. Jesus is reappropriating the empire's language. But rather than being a military warrior amassing power through violence, Jesus points to a kind of rule where violence is not used to control, where there is space for other sheep, where the pasture is cared for in such a way that there is enough for everyone and not just for the advantaged. If we're willing to swim this far below the surface, then we might also notice that when John wrote his gospel, he placed this story immediately after the story of the man born blind. We recall that discussion about why this man had been born blind and that he or his parents must have done something sinful and therefore deserved to be ostracized. Jesus comes along, heals the man, and in the process dismantles a rigid ethic of included, excluded, worthy, unworthy, and therefore all the energy and economy spent on gates and walls and doors establishing who deserves to be in the fold and who does not is a colossal waste of religious energy. Not to mention, it is nobody else's call but Jesus's. John says the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying. And maybe they didn't. Or maybe they did. And all these years later, we too understand their struggle. We know now, just as John's gospel knew then, that what Jesus said can be easily co-opted so that it looks nothing like what Jesus said. We know that abundant life has been hijacked to mean prosperity or success or gain or power or control. Kirk Byron Jones writes, "In the final analysis, being fine with flourishing has to do less with how much you have and more with a heightened appreciation for the value of whatever you do have." James Howell reminds us the Greek word abundantly means overflowing. And then he comments, "I saw a marquee the other day that said, 'If someone asks if my cup is half full or half empty, I just feel lucky to have a cup.' If there is an overflowing, an abundance, it is not things or other measurables, but a sense of God's mercy, an at-homeness with God, a realizing of reconciliation." If we're willing to dive this deep, then maybe we would be willing to let the Good Shepherd be the Good Shepherd, which is to say, it is his gate for letting people in and opening up another way to be in this world, rather than anyone else's gate for shutting people out and closing down any possibility for the new. If we're willing to let the Good Shepherd be the Good Shepherd, then what we hear is that there is rarely a good reason for anyone to be removed from the flock, even though there may be days when we can come up with a flock of reasons why people don't belong. Because if we know anything at all, we know there is not a perfect sheep in the fold. The only thing needed is the ability to listen to the sound of his voice. That is the open gate through which the Good Shepherd welcomes. Now, we know that the voice of the Good Shepherd may not be settled. Sometimes Jesus' own voice can sound different. But those in the flock hear that when Jesus speaks, even when he has something hard to say, he says it with a tone of love in his voice rather than condemnation. We're not saying that anything goes and it doesn't matter how we treat others, but we are saying the ethic in the flock resembles Jesus, and Jesus is not about kicking sheep out of the fold. In fact, it's the opposite. And he says so. There are other sheep not in this fold who are mine also. I must bring them in, and they will listen to my voice too, so that we can be one flock. There may be those who don't like some of the other sheep Jesus brings in, and may go looking for a flock where the sheep all look and sound alike, but that is not the work of the Good Shepherd. And the voice of the Good Shepherd never has the tone of arrogance or self-justification in it, a tone that seeks to prove or defend itself. Instead, it is a voice that reveals or points toward a way of living, who invites all of us to live more deeply. It's the kind of voice with the tones of humility and gratitude. And the voice of the Good Shepherd speaks in the cadences of hope, not fear, honesty, not manipulation, confession, not control. It is the kind of voice who, as Jesus said, lays down his or her life for another. While we never stop listening for the voice of the Good Shepherd, at some point along life's way, the sound of his voice is to be echoed in the sound of our voices. In the last chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus meets with Peter, and he tells him that he is to embody the Good Shepherd and likewise feed and love the flock. He speaks, says the Gospel of John. He speaks, wrote C. Austin Miles in 1912. And so, whether in John's Gospel or in a sentimental hymn, the good news is he speaks. And we hear the sound of his voice.